I'm Captain Logan Matthews. I'm 40 years old, and up until last year, I thought I had built a life nothing could shake. I spent over 2 decades in the U.S. Army, served in 3 combat zones, led men into fire, and carried them out when the worst happened. My uniform meant something to me. Respect wasn't just given, it was earned one mission, one scar, one sacrifice at a time. And then, in just 1 week, everything I believed in crumbled. It started with a medical discharge I never saw coming. After a mandatory psych eval, they said I showed signs of severe post-traumatic stress. The words were clinical, cold, and final. Fit for duty no longer. They stripped my rank, my purpose, and everything I thought defined me. My wife, Emily, stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed when I told her. She didn't cry. She didn't ask how I was. She just said our daughter needed stability. Said I had changed. She packed a bag for Sophie, called her sister to pick them up, and walked out the door like I was already a memory. The last thing I saw was my little girl turning around in the back seat, confused and quiet. I didn't fight it. I couldn't. My head was too full of static, my body numb like I'd taken a hit I didn't feel until hours later. Then came the court order. Emily had filed for full custody and listed my condition as a threat. I sat in that courtroom in a suit I hadn't worn since promotion day, listening to a lawyer describe me like I was broken, dangerous, unfit to be a father. The judge agreed. That same afternoon, I handed over the keys to the family home, the place I'd painted myself where Sophie's height was still marked on the kitchen wall. Gone. In 1 week, I lost the army, my family, my home, and the last thread of dignity I had left. And the worst part, no one stopped to ask if I was okay. Friends disappeared. Commanding officers who once called me brother wouldn't return a call. 1 week was all it took to erase 20 years of loyalty. And there I was, a man trained to survive war, completely unprepared for the battlefield of losing everything that mattered. My father was Colonel Frank Matthews, a man whose name carried weight long after he was gone. He served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. His medals filled an entire shadow box that hung above our fireplace, each one polished to a perfect shine by his own hand. At his funeral, they called him a hero, a leader, a man who embodied everything the army stood for. I remember standing beside his casket, watching the flag fold over his coffin, thinking that I was supposed to be just like him. From the time I was old enough to understand words like duty and honor, he made sure those were the pillars of my life. When I scraped my knee as a kid, he didn't pick me up. He told me to stand tall, to act like a soldier, even if I wasn't one yet. I used to think he was carved from stone. He never raised his voice, but when he looked at me, I always felt small, like I was being measured against an invisible standard I couldn't see but somehow always fell short of. When other kids played baseball after school, I was running drills in the backyard. Push-ups, sit-ups, timed laps around the block. My father said that excellence wasn't optional in our family. I didn't understand it then, but every order, every silence was a test. I thought if I passed enough of them, he'd smile at me the way he smiled in old photos with his men. But that smile never came. I used to hear stories about him from other soldiers. They said he was fearless, the kind of man who led from the front. He never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. I was proud, of course, but pride came with a shadow. Every compliment they gave him reminded me of how far I had to go. I wanted to make him proud more than anything, and that hunger drove everything I did. When he died, I was 19, just starting my first year of college. I dropped out the next month and enlisted. I told people it was for the love of country, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see his face in mine to earn the same kind of respect he had. I thought maybe if I wore the same uniform and stood in the same dust, I'd understand him better. Maybe I'd even make peace with the part of him that always felt just out of reach. My mother tried to talk me out of it. She said my father's silence wasn't strength. I didn't listen. I saw her words as weakness. I packed my duffel and shipped off with a sense of purpose I had never known before. For years I chased that ghost. Every deployment, every medal, every sleepless night was a letter I was writing to a man who couldn't read it. The longer I served, the more I became like him. I learned to shut out fear, to lock it behind walls of discipline. I stopped talking about my feelings because that's what soldiers did. I became respected but not known, admired but never understood. And in the quiet moments between missions, I started to see my father in my reflection. Same posture, same silence, same eyes that never seemed to rest. I visited his grave every time I came home on leave. The headstone was simple white marble with his name and rank. An American flag always fluttered beside it. I'd stand there in full uniform medals, glinting in the sun, waiting for something: approval, forgiveness, a sign that he was proud. But all I ever got was the sound of the wind moving through the cemetery trees. Looking back, I think I confused discipline with love. My father believed the army was the only way to make a man out of me. I believed that too. And so I built my life, chasing an image that was never really mine. I buried my own dreams somewhere along the way. I loved to draw, to build things with my hands, but those passions were childish in his eyes. He used to say, "Soldiers don't paint, son. They fight." I spent most of my life fighting for a version of his approval that never came. When I finally earned the rank of captain, I stood in front of the mirror and tried to feel proud. But the truth was, I only felt tired. I had carried his legacy so long it started to crush me. He was a hero. I was his son. And for most of my life, that was both my greatest honor and my greatest curse. Now, standing at his grave years later, I can finally admit it. My father was a war hero, but he never learned how to come home. And maybe that's why I never learned how to live. When the military let me go, it wasn't with a handshake or a thank you. It came in the form of a sterile document stamped with the words "unfit for duty." I sat in the base medical office, still in uniform, while a doctor read through the report like I was a number in a system, not a man who had given everything. He said my PTSD was too advanced, that I was a liability. I barely heard the rest. All I could think was that everything I had built was about to vanish. 2 days later, my access badge was deactivated. I walked out of the gate for the last time holding a cardboard box with my personal belongings. No farewell ceremony, no flag, no brotherhood. Just silence. I thought I'd go home and figure things out, maybe take a few weeks to breathe. But home wasn't home anymore. Emily didn't look surprised when I told her. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, same as always when things got tense. She didn't yell. She just said it. The kids need stability. That was her way of saying she was leaving. I asked her to wait, to give me time to believe in me, like she used to. But I could already see the distance in her eyes. She packed up Sophie's clothes, their favorite books, and left a key on the counter. No hug. No goodbye. Just the sound of her car backing out of the driveway. I stood there holding one of Sophie's stuffed animals, wondering how my whole world could fall apart in a week. I kept thinking, this isn't real. This isn't how it's supposed to end. After that, the silence became unbearable. Friends who once called me a hero stopped picking up. Guys from my unit ghosted me like I had the plague. The community that used to smile and wave when I wore my uniform now looked through me like I didn't exist. I went to church one Sunday, and no one said a word. I was invisible, like my life only mattered when I was in uniform. Nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't feel. I'd stare at the ceiling, my mind replaying every failure, every face I'd let down. I started believing what they said, that I was unstable, that I was dangerous, that I was a burden. I started drinking to shut out the noise, but the shame stayed. No matter what I did, it stayed. I stopped looking in mirrors. I couldn't face the man staring back at me, the one who used to be a leader, a protector, a father. Now just someone people whispered about, someone who didn't belong. I was no longer Captain Logan Matthews. I was just a broken man nobody wanted around. The phone rang just past midnight. I almost didn't answer. These days nothing good ever comes after dark. But something in me picked up. Maybe it was boredom, maybe instinct, maybe the sheer emptiness that had taken over my life. The voice on the other end was low and unfamiliar. It spoke just one sentence that made my blood run cold. Check under your father's grave. There's something there meant for you. I froze. For a second I thought it was some sick prank. But the way the voice said it, calm, steady, certain, rattled something deep in me. Before I could ask who it was, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my heart thudding, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. Who would say something like that? Why now the next morning I tried to forget about it. I mowed the lawn, walked around the block, stared at the TV without really watching. But the words stayed in my head circling like vultures. Check under your father's grave. I hadn't visited the cemetery in months. Last time I was there, I could barely look at the stone without feeling like I'd let him down. By the second day, I wasn't just haunted, I was consumed. I needed to know if it was real. The mystery gnawed at me more than the fear. It didn't make sense, but then again nothing in my life did anymore. I had no job, no family, no identity, just ghosts and regret. What more could I possibly lose that night I drove to the cemetery? I didn't tell anyone. I just grabbed a flashlight, a shovel, and headed into the dark. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. My father's grave sat beneath an old pine tree near the edge of the hill. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide if I was crazy. But the truth was, I had already fallen so far there was no point in turning back. If he left something for me, I needed to see it. I needed to believe that maybe he had seen the man I used to be. The man I still hoped I could become. The ground was cold and heavier than I expected. Every shovel full felt like digging through my own shame. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to stop me, half hoping someone would. The wind rattled the branches above, but all I could hear was my breath and the scrape of metal against earth. I didn't know what I was looking for. I only knew I had to keep going. After what felt like hours, the shovel hit something solid. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock. It was wood. I dropped to my knees, brushed away the dirt with shaking hands, and there it was. A box. Old, weathered, heavy. On the lid was one word, carved deep into the surface. Logan. My name. For a long moment I couldn't move. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might wake the dead. I placed my hand on the box, almost afraid it would vanish. Then, slowly, carefully, I pried the lid open. It creaked like an old door stiff with time. The smell of damp wood and something older filled the air. Inside were three things: a stack of letters wrapped in twine, a small leather pouch, and a single folded note resting on top. I reached for the note first. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The handwriting was firm, familiar. My father's. It read, "A man's worth is how he rises." That was it. No greeting, no signature. Just that one sentence. I stared at it until the words blurred. My throat tightened. I hadn't cried since Afghanistan. I didn't know I still could. Then I opened the pouch. Gold coins spilled into my hand, heavy, real old. I didn't know where they came from or why they were here. But I knew they meant something. They weren't just money. They were a message. A legacy. Maybe even an apology. Finally, I picked up the letters. The first envelope was addressed simply, "To my son." I opened it with care, like it might fall apart. The words hit me like a wave. He wrote about his regrets, about the weight he carried as a father, about how he saw pieces of himself in me, both the good and the broken. He said he wished he had told me more while he was alive, that his silence came from fear, not lack of love. He wrote that he had buried this box, knowing one day I might need it more than anything, that if I ever hit bottom, I would still have this, a reason to keep going. I sat there in the dirt, letters in my lap, coins in the grass beside me, and I cried. The kind of crying that shakes your whole body, that pulls something loose inside you. I cried for the years I spent chasing a version of him I thought I had to be. I cried for the boy who never heard his father say he was proud. And I cried because finally, somehow I had. My father had saved me, not with medals or orders, but with his words, with truth, with this moment. The cemetery was still, but I felt something shift, like he was there, like he had been waiting all along. I sold just enough of the coins to pay off my smallest debts, not to escape, but to start. With what was left, I bought a toolbox, some basic gear, and a second-hand pickup. Nothing fancy, just enough to get my hands dirty again. The first job I found was hauling lumber at a construction site. The pay was low and the hours long. But for the first time in a while, I felt something real. Each night after work, I came home with sore arms and calloused hands. I'd shower heat up whatever I had in the fridge, then sit by the window with one of my father's letters. He had written over a dozen, some short, some long. Each one peeled back a layer of the man I had feared and misunderstood for so long. He had felt weak once. He had doubted himself. And yet, he kept going. Reading his words became a ritual. They weren't just memories. They were instructions, reminders that pain wasn't a dead end. It was a door. One night I read a letter where he admitted he had once thought of walking away from it all. But something stopped him. He never said what. Maybe it was family. Maybe faith. Or maybe it was the same thing I felt now. A quiet pull to keep going. Little by little, my mindset shifted. I stopped waking up bitter. I started waking up thankful. I no longer saw the world as something I had lost. I saw it as something I still had a chance to rebuild. The letters helped, but it wasn't just the words. It was the truth behind them. My father had once stood where I stood, at rock bottom, and he had climbed. I picked up more jobs, repaired fences, painted houses, replaced drywall for neighbors who didn't ask questions. I didn't care what it was. As long as I earned every dollar with my own hands, I was proud of it. And with each task finished, each handshake earned, a part of me came back to life. People noticed. My mother was the first. She dropped by one day with a basket of groceries and stood at the doorway. "You're standing taller," she said. I didn't know I had changed, but I guess I had. It wasn't just the muscles coming back. It was something in my eyes. The weight was still there, but I wasn't letting it crush me anymore. There were setbacks. Some days I got turned down for work. Some nights I still dreamed of the military, of my kids. But I didn't let it stop me. I would read another letter, hear his voice in my head. Remember that line from the note? "A man's worth is how he rises." And I'd get back up. Those words weren't just about redemption. They were about identity. I wasn't a failed officer. I wasn't a broken husband. I was a man who had been knocked down and chose to stand again. And every blister, every drop of sweat was proof I was becoming someone new. I walked through the rows of stone markers with a bouquet of fresh wildflowers in hand. The air was still and the sky was just starting to blush with morning light. I found my father's grave beneath the same oak tree where everything had started, and I knelt, placing the flowers gently at the base of the headstone. I sat there for a while, my hand resting on the cool stone, and I spoke softly. I told him about the work, the pain, the slow climb back. I told him I had read it, every letter, held every word close, and used them to rebuild the man he always believed I could be. Then I said the words I had carried in my chest since the night I opened that box. I am not a failure. I am your son. Saying it out loud didn't just feel like the truth. It felt like freedom. I stood up and took one last look at his name carved in stone. This time it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. I turned and walked back toward my truck, the same one that had once carried a broken man to this very place. Now I want to speak to you. If you've fallen, if the world has tried to convince you that you're less than who you are, hear this. You are not a failure. You have the strength to rise. Maybe not all at once, but one step, one breath, one choice at a time. My father's words saved me, but what saved me even more was choosing to believe them. Maybe someone out there needs to hear this story today. Maybe it's you, or maybe it's someone you care about. So if this meant something to you, share it. Pass it on. Let it be the hand someone needs to stand up again. We rise stronger when we rise together.